Hey, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am taking a little bit of time off throughout the month because I want to enjoy some quiet time with my family for the holidays, and I hope you are doing the same thing too. But because it is the holiday season, it is the perfect time to enjoy a sourdough bake-a-thon. So this video is a compilation of some of my favorite sourdough recipes, all of which you can find over on my blog at moonandmagnolia.com. And these are great to make during the holidays, whether you want to make some sweet treats, some festive bread, or if you are looking for a savory sourdough dish to bake for your family for the holidays. But really, all of these recipes are good all year long. But because this is about an hour of sourdough baking, I recommend turning on your Christmas tree, wrapping some presents, and just letting this run in the background so you can learn some new recipes and tips along the way. I will leave the links for all of these recipes and the original videos that they are from in the description box. But without further ado, let's get into this sourdough bake-a-thon. So here I am making my regular cinnamon roll dough, but I actually use coconut oil for this, and I did not have any coconut oil, so I tested this with butter. And this is a really important point because what I found through testing it with butter is I did not like it as much with butter. It wasn't bad, but it was definitely not up to the quality that I would want for gifting sourdough cinnamon rolls or a sourdough snowflake to someone else. And this is really important to know now, so that way I know to get coconut oil and to stick with the original recipe. These are the things you want to learn before you give the gift, so that way you can make the gift and it's exactly what you want it to be. One of the nice things about gifting sourdough versus other types of baked goods is that the dough can cold proof in the fridge for up to 3 days, sometimes even more. So that means you can pace the process when you're actually making these for gifts. So you don't have to bake everything on one day. You can make the dough and then bake it at your convenience or as you need it for different holiday gatherings. So here I took half of that sourdough cinnamon roll dough, and then I put one half in the fridge for later, and the other half I divided into 4 portions and then rolled them out into about an 8-inch circle. And just for reference, I think each of those circles were probably about 1/8 of an inch thick or so. You definitely don't want them too thick. It's better to err on the side of too thin than too thick for this. And then on each layer, I brushed on some melted butter and then sprinkled it with a mixture of cinnamon, brown sugar, and granulated sugar. And I recommend recipe testing this and seeing how much sugar cinnamon mixture you like in between the layers. I don't think I used enough in this case. Then I'm just taking a tablespoon and making an imprint of a circle. That's just a guide so you know not to cut past that line. And then what I did is I quartered the dough, so it was 4 triangles. Then I cut those triangles in half, so it was 8 triangles. And then I cut them in half again, so it ended up being 16 triangles. Then you take 2 pieces or 2 triangles that are side by side, twist them away from each other, pinch the ends together, and then tuck it underneath. Then I set this aside to proof until it was slightly puffy. And then once it was ready to bake, I just brushed it with an egg wash and then baked it for about 20, maybe 25 minutes at 375. You could definitely fill this with Nutella. I think it'd be really good too with Trader Joe's cookie butter. It's really up to you. And then once it was completely cool, I sprinkled it with a little bit of powdered sugar, which was really pretty. But remember, if it is a little bit warm, that powdered sugar will dissolve, and it will dissolve eventually. So I wouldn't sprinkle the powdered sugar on until right before you're ready to package it and give it. Now I put this in one of these little ones to show you how to make a really easy and beautiful babka holiday wreath. Now for this babka dough, I am using the entire batch of the dough to make one large wreath. But one thing that I think is really important to keep in mind when it comes to gifting sourdough is you can make smaller versions of everything. Make 1 or 2 batches of dough and make little mini loaves of bread. Make little mini wreaths or make small sourdough snowflakes. Whatever it is you're making, you can make a little bit smaller so that way you don't have to make so much dough. But in this case, I am making one large wreath. So I have the sourdough babka dough in the fridge. It stayed in the fridge for another 2 or 3 days. Now I can't remember how many days my dough was in the fridge, but it stayed in the fridge for a few days. And now I am assembling the actual babka itself. So first first I am making the chocolate filling, which is a combination of butter, chocolate chips, cocoa powder, and powdered sugar. In the past, I used granulated sugar for my babka filling, and it just was not as good. I couldn't get the texture right, but the powdered sugar definitely did the trick. So that is what I'll be sticking with when I make this for my holiday gifts. I'm dividing the dough in half and then rolling each half into a large rectangle, each the exact same size if possible. One tip for rolling out dough like this is to do it while it's cold. So if your dough's been in the fridge, don't take it out and let it come to room temperature. Take it out and immediately roll it. It's just a little bit easier to shape that way. That chocolate filling needs to cool off, so I let it sit for about 30 minutes or so, and just to speed up that process, I just stirred it up every few minutes to help it cool off a little bit faster. And then once it's cool, I am just smoothing half of the chocolate filling on one portion of the dough and then the remaining half on the other portion of the dough. And you don't want to take the filling all the way to the edges because that will make it really hard to roll and shape later. So I leave about a 1/2 inch border around the dough and then roll the dough long edge to long edge. And once you get that dough rolled, pinch the seam so it's nice and closed. And then I like to take a bench cutter and then cut off the ends of the dough where it's not very tidy. That just makes a nice clean braid later. Then take a serrated knife and then just cut each roll in half long ways, and then you're simply just twisting the two pieces. As you're twisting them, just make sure you're keeping those ribbons of chocolate facing up. You don't want any of them to turn down. That will affect the aesthetic of the wreath once you bake it. Then once you have both strands twisted, transfer them to a parchment lined baking sheet, and then you're just connecting those ends so you can make a circle. I tried to make it look like those ends were braided. It can be a little confusing which side goes to which at that point, but as best as you can, connect those two ends and then tuck the loose pieces under so that way they don't lift when you bake it. I let this proof for about an hour or so until it was just slightly puffy, and then baked it at 375 for about 25 minutes or so. Then to gift this, I would recommend moving it to a clean piece of parchment paper because a lot of that chocolate leaks out. So I used a pizza paddle just to move it to a clean sheet of paper. And now I am decorating this with little cranberries just to make it festive. You could definitely take little toothpicks and fix those cranberries in there so they don't move. I did not do that in this case because I'm just testing it. But it's really up to you. You could decorate this with whatever you wanted. Little sprigs of rosemary would be pretty in one spot. You could use cherries instead of cranberries. If you are going to give sourdough pumpkin prosciutto focaccia. And what I really like about making this focaccia is that it is a 1-day recipe and it doesn't require any kneading or any stretch and folds, but it really harnesses in a lot of those fall flavors. So here I am just adding about 3 3/4 cups of flour into a bowl. I did not feel like converting my original yeast recipe for this into grams, and focaccia is pretty forgiving, so I am just using regular old cup measurements here. And then about a 1/2 cup of sourdough starter straight out of the fridge, unfed, which makes it even easier. 3/4 cups of water and a cup of canned pumpkin. Now, if you have leftover canned pumpkin, I will show you in a few minutes something really fun you can do with that leftover pumpkin. And now I am just mixing this together. I tried using my Danish dough whisk, but the shape of that bowl made it a huge mess. So sometimes you just got to get your hands right in there and mix the ingredients together. And all I'm doing is mixing this until it is mostly combined and letting it sit for 30 minutes. When you first mix the ingredients, that dough is pretty sticky, so don't let that alarm you. That is normal for focaccia. But now after 30 minutes, you can see it is much less sticky and I can really handle it without it sticking to my hands too much. And what is really awesome about this recipe is now I'm just shaping it into a ball and I'm setting it aside to bulk ferment for the day. I am using my Brood & Taylor proofing box so I can set the temperature to 81 degrees. I really want to have this ready for dinner time, so I just want to make sure that it's bulk fermented and ready to go. But you could also just let this sit at room temperature overnight until it is doubled and domed. Okay, let's get back to this really delicious fall sourdough pumpkin prosciutto focaccia. So this was in the proofing box for, I'd say, about 5.5 to 6 hours, and you can see it is doubled and domed on top. So first I am preparing a baking sheet and putting some olive oil on it. Just so you know, I was not paying attention and I put way too much olive oil on there. You really only need about 2 tablespoons of olive oil. I am turning the dough out onto that oil baking sheet sheet, and I think this is a 10 by 15 baking sheet, so it's pretty big. And I'm using my hands to gently just shape the dough into a rectangle. On a baking sheet this size, the dough probably won't be big enough to fill up the entire sheet, but that is okay. And then I'm covering this in plastic and setting it aside for about an hour and a half or 2 hours for a second rise. I put it on top of my proofing box so that way it would stay a little bit warmer and hopefully rise faster, but the second rise isn't quite as particular as the first when it comes to focaccia. In the meantime, I am slicing up some prosciutto, and then when this is puffy, I am getting ready to bake it. So you can see it is puffy. I think technically I could have let it do a second rise a little longer, but this is so forgiving, it does not matter. I am brushing it with some olive oil and then adding a little bit of thyme. This would also be really good with fresh rosemary if you have any. And I am sprinkling it pretty generously with some Parmesan cheese, and I'm adding on some salted pumpkin seeds and prosciutto. You can really put anything you want on this, and I will say the more toppings, the merrier when it comes to a focaccia like this. Now, traditionally, you would use your fingertips to poke the dough before topping it, but I like to do it after topping it just so it kind of mushes those toppings down into the dough. Somewhere along the lines, I heard that dimpling the dough like that allows little pockets for the oil to get into to make it nice and crispy and delicious, but either way, you will be totally fine. This then bakes for 20 minutes at 400 degrees. Truly, I think this is one of the easiest breads you can make because it requires almost nothing. No kneading, no mixing, no stretch and folds. You can have it done by dinner time. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, I made this with inactive starter straight out of the fridge. And this was such a cozy and delicious weeknight bread. So here I am just simply combining 2 cups of all-purpose flour, 1 teaspoon of salt, and a 1/4 cup of granulated sugar in a large bowl. This is a pie crust, so it does of course call for very cold butter. So I put 2 sticks of butter in the freezer about an hour before making this. And I like to shred the butter. This just helps work it in a little bit better, and that cold butter just ensures a nice flaky pie crust. Now, this truly is a discard recipe, so you can use whatever starter you have, whether it's active starter that you stir down, or if you're like me and just grabbing some from the back of your fridge. The longer it's been in your fridge, the more sour it will be, so keep that in mind, but otherwise you can use whatever starter you have. I like to use a pastry cutter to cut that butter into the dry ingredients, but only until the butter is about the size of a pea, no smaller than that. And then I just add in the sourdough discard and mix it together. I know you want to keep that butter nice and cold, but I have found that I just really need to use my hands to really form that dough into one ball. And the warmth of my hands can melt the butter a little bit, but this seems to work the best. What's really important to note is that the shape of your dough at this point will determine how easy your dough is to roll out in the desired shape later. So we want rectangles later on to make the Pop-Tart. So it's really important, in my opinion, just to make things easy, to cut the dough in half and then shape each half into a rectangle. It just makes it easier later on. If you shape it into a circle and then pop it in the refrigerator for an hour or so, now you have to turn a circle into a rectangle, whereas if you shape it in a rectangle, you just have to make it a bigger rectangle. Then I'm just putting the dough in the fridge for an hour, but it can be in there for up to 3 days. And if you want to long ferment the grains for easier digestion, for example, you can just keep the dough in the fridge for 3 days for a long fermentation. But I just left it in there for an hour. I rolled this into a pretty thin rectangle, about 1/8 of an inch thick, and now I'm using a pizza cutter to just trim up the edges. It isn't really necessary to trim up the edges, but it does make it a little easier to assemble the Pop-Tarts, and it looks a lot nicer too. If you want to see some sloppy edges, just fast forward or wait until we get to the Hot Pockets. I really messed some of those up. But now I am taking a pizza cutter and I am just cutting this into 4 rectangles. I recommend moving those rectangles to a cookie sheet or a baking sheet that is lined with parchment paper and heavily floured. The reason why I like to move the dough first before assembling them is because they're a little hard to handle once you get them assembled. So that way they're already on the baking sheet and ready to go. I'm filling these with about 1.5 tablespoons, maybe even up to 2 tablespoons of homemade strawberry jam that I made with strawberries my daughter picked. And then I am simply folding them over short end to short end, using my fingers to pinch the sides closed, and then I take a fork to crimp them. Now, the other thing I like about putting the dough on the cookie sheet or the baking sheet is that you can really easily just spin that sheet around and access all 4 sides of the Pop-Tarts. But I want to talk about the filling for a second. So you can use more than 1.5 or 2 tablespoons of filling, and you can use whatever you want. You can use blueberry jam, Nutella. If you're watching this in fall, I think these would be really good with the pumpkin butter or apple butter. So they're really flexible and versatile, and you can also add more to them. It's been a minute since I've had a store-bought Pop-Tart, but if my memory serves me correctly, they don't have a lot of filling in them. So just to keep it true to the Pop-Tart nostalgia, I'm just using a little bit of filling. And then I am just brushing them with a very simple egg wash, 1 egg yolk mixed with a tablespoon of water. I baked the Pop-Tarts at 350 for about 25 minutes and then let them come all the way down to room temperature. And now I am making the icing, which is 1 cup of powdered sugar, and I'm adding 1 teaspoon of water in at a time until it reaches a nice smooth and glossy consistency. When I was a teenager, I used to drive to the gas station on my way to school and get a Pop-Tart and a Mountain Dew for breakfast. Those days are long gone, but these sourdough Pop-Tart days are here too. Cereals. I love cereal. I try not to buy it that often because I do prefer to have a more nutritious breakfast for myself and my family. And I'm not saying that this sourdough cinnamon toast crunch is necessarily low calorie, but it's definitely simple ingredients that I feel good serving for a treat or a breakfast once in a while. I also feel like I should pause for 1 second and let you know we are having a thunderstorm. So if you can hear a lot of thunder in the background, my apologies, but I guess it just adds to the ambiance. The process of making the dough for sourdough cinnamon toast crunch is almost identical to the process for making the Pop-Tart dough. Really, the only variation is in the ingredients. There is less butter in this, but there's more sugar and of course some added cinnamon. But the first thing that I'm doing is I'm mixing together cinnamon and sugar in a small bowl and setting that aside. And now I'm mixing together the dry ingredients. So just like the pie dough, I also have butter in the freezer and I'm shredding it so I can work it in with a pastry cutter. But it's not imperative for that butter to stay really cold like a pie crust. So I am putting this in the freezer just because I have some other things to do and I want it to stay cold. But you can work that butter in right away and you don't even have to worry about putting this dough in the fridge for any length of time unless you prefer to bulk ferment it. For this dough, I am adding a teaspoon of cold water at a time to help it come together. You definitely don't want it to be wet and soggy, but it is a little bit of a wetter dough than the pie crust. The trickiest part I found when I was recipe testing this was moving the dough to the parchment paper. So I recommend taking a piece of parchment paper about the same size as your baking sheet and rolling out your dough on that. Now, what really helps is to take a little bit of that cinnamon and sugar mixture and spread it on the parchment paper and then heavily dust it. This will help it prevent sticking and it will add a little bit of cinnamon sugar flavor to your dough. Then I am rolling the dough out to, again, about 1/8 of an inch thick. I put my flour container here to hold the parchment paper down. That's a bad idea. Just 2 days ago, I made a video where I broke a bowl doing something similar. I guess old habits die hard, right? But I would recommend putting something there that's not breakable or wouldn't make a mess if it falls to hold the parchment paper down. And since I'm cutting this into small pieces, I don't even worry about trimming the edges. So cut long ways and then cut sideways and make yourself some little Cinnamon Toast Crunch squares. Now I am heavily brushing these with some melted butter and then also heavily sprinkling them with the cinnamon and sugar mixture. Then these go in the oven at 450 for about 20 to 25 minutes. Mine took about 22 minutes until they were ready. But one thing to keep in mind is the thinner the dough, the crunchier your cereal will be. So make sure you're really getting it pretty thin. Between my 3-year-old daughter and me, this stuff did not stand a chance. It is crunchy and sweet. It's good by itself. It's great in a bowl of milk. And this is definitely one of our new family favorites. I'm sure it will be one of your family favorites too. Making a sourdough walnut cranberry bread, and this is my regular no knead sourdough bread recipe. In this case, I use 200 grams of fresh milled hard white winter wheat, and I am basically just making a no knead bread but adding in walnuts and cranberries, which I'll show you how to do in just a minute. Because I'm using fresh milled flour, it's really important that that flour can autolyze, meaning that the water and flour can sit for a while so the flour can soak up that water. So I'm letting that rest for about 45 minutes. And in the meantime, I am weighing out 100 grams of dried cranberries and then filling the bowl with water to let them soak. And I am toasting up some walnut halves. So toasting the walnuts adds so much flavor to this bread in the end. Do not skip this part because it is delicious. Once the walnuts become aromatic, it's about 5 minutes or so on medium-high heat. I'm putting them on a plate to cool off. And now I am adding in the sourdough starter and salt into that flour water mixture. And just as a side note, going back to those cranberries, the reason why you soak them is because it plumps them up and makes them juicy and delicious in this sourdough bread. But also, we don't want the moisture from the bread going into the cranberries. We want to keep that high hydration to help create a really soft bread in the end. So pre-soaking them yields better flavor and better texture. Because this is my regular no knead sourdough bread, I doubled up, and half of it I'm making a plain old loaf to use for sourdough stuffing, and then the other half I'm making this cranberry walnut bread. So I am splitting it up half and half, and I'd like to say I was 1 gram off from a perfect 50-50 split. I'm pretty impressed with myself. But before putting the inclusions in, I am doing 1 round of stretch and folds to help that dough build just a little bit of strength so it can hold the weight of the walnuts and the cranberries. So then after that first round of stretch and folds, I let it sit for about 15 minutes. Then I'm adding in the walnuts, which I chopped up, and the cranberries. And then I'm just doing regular stretch and folds to work them into that dough. And while I'm stretching and folding, I'm kind of squeezing the dough a little bit just to get them worked in there. It is time to finish up this bread. So it fermented, I'd say, for about 7 hours or so. One thing I did not mention is that I used completely unfed sourdough starter. It had been in my fridge for like 5 or 6 days without being fed. That will definitely work, but it takes longer to ferment. So I ended up putting it in my proofing box to speed up the process. So now that it has doubled in size and starting to dome on top, I'm just shaping it, letting it rest for about 20 minutes. And now I am putting it in Banneton baskets and I am stitching the dough. So this is where you pull opposite ends and pull them across and pinch it together along the length of the dough. And what that does is it creates more surface tension. And I have experimented lately with stitching the dough twice, meaning I stitch the full length of the dough and then I fold and pinch over the short ends, and then I go back and stitch the full length of the dough one more time. And that has worked really well for me. I think it's definitely worth trying. And you can see after cold proofing overnight and then baking, this bread is beautiful. It is so good. And my husband and I had this revelation today that this would make the best sausage and cranberry walnut stuffing. So I'm going to work on that recipe Sourdough discard apple cider donuts. And I have this recipe over my blog at moonandmagnolia.com. I will leave a link for that below in the description box. But first, you just take a cup of apple cider and you reduce it down to about a half a cup. And then it's pretty much like any other baked good where you mix the dry ingredients, cream, the butter, and sugar. I always recommend adding the egg and the sourdough discard at the same time because the egg helps that discard mix in, and then you mix everything together. I have a recipe for fried sourdough donuts that are killer over on my blog too. But what I like about these baked versions is that it's easy to make with my daughter. It's really hard to knead dough and of course fry dough with a small child, but this is something that we can really easily make and do together and create those memories. And of course we go out to the fall festivals when the weather starts to cool off, and there's always food trucks and donut trucks, and that's fun. We like to do those things too, but it really feels special to make these things at home. When you make these donuts, I do recommend using a piping bag or even a Ziploc bag just to put it in the donut pan. That makes it a little bit easier, but otherwise, if you have baked a cake, you can make these donuts for sure. Once the donuts are in the oven, I just bake them at 350 for about 15 minutes, and when they're cool enough to handle, I brush them with a little bit of butter and a mixture of cinnamon and sugar. You could definitely skip that part, but it's way better with them. But I will say, the last time I made these, I had a sugar that was a little more finely ground, and it worked better for that topping. My daughter kept calling these crunchy donuts because we kind of have a coarse ground sugar right now. So if you have a finely ground granulated sugar, that would work better, but it'll be delicious either way. These sourdough soft pretzels, I am combining about 100 grams of sourdough starter, 255 grams of water, 40 grams of honey, but honestly, next time I think I would just use plain old sugar, about 2 teaspoons or so of kosher salt, and 500 grams of bread flour. We'll get back to the celebration in a minute, but I want to talk to you about bread flour for a second because I've learned a lot about different types of flours over the last year. So bread flour is used when you want a really light and fluffy product, and it works because it has a higher protein content and the dough is actually stronger. You would think that with a stronger dough, it wouldn't create a light and fluffy product, but because it's stronger, it can hold air pockets better, which creates a fluffier end product. So if you want to adapt any recipe for it to be a little bit fluffier, using bread flour is a great option. You might have to change the hydration just a little bit, but it will work. And I know we're just talking about bread flour here, but one of the things that I think goes ignored often when people look at homemaking and homemakers from the outside is how much homemakers know and how much they learn. We often think about what they do, but we don't talk about the skills that homemakers continue to grow over the course of not just their time as, say, mothers, for example, but over the course of a lifetime. Sure, everyone learns things in their lives, but often homemakers are learning new skills so they can keep providing for their families. And again, as I always say, that goes unpaid. If it were a corporate job, all the things that you are learning and all the training you get come hopefully with some sort of compensation. But the only compensation we get as homemakers is some sense of self-gratification and hopefully a lot of gratitude from our family members too. Once the dough bulk ferments, I'm just shaping them into pretzels. You can divide them into as many portions as you want. I think I did 16. My daughter did steal some of the dough to play with, so I think I ended up with less than 16. But I'm shaping them into pretzels, doing a second rise for about an hour. Then they go into a pot of boiling water with baking soda, which gives them that nice pretzel-y tang, for about 30 seconds on each side. Then before they go in the oven, give them an egg wash, 1 egg yolk with a tablespoon of water mixed together, put some salt on, and bake them at 425 for about 10 to 15 minutes until golden. I am prepping a couple sourdough pie crusts for a sourdough chicken pot pie, which I'll show you how to make later in this video. But what I like about a sourdough pie crust, for instance, is that you can make it up to 3 days in advance. I usually stick the butter in the freezer for at least 30 minutes before I plan on making the pie dough. And then once it's nice and cold, I shred it on a box grater and then put it back into the freezer until I make the rest of the pie dough. So that way it stays nice and cold while I'm getting the other ingredients together. I need a double pie crust, so I am doubling this recipe. So that was 2 sticks of frozen butter, and then I'm putting in 2 cups of all-purpose flour, 1 teaspoon of salt, and 1 teaspoon of granulated sugar. Then I'm cutting that frozen butter back into those dry ingredients and adding in the sourdough starter. So I actually ended up not having enough sourdough starter, but luckily something like a pie dough is really forgiving. So I needed a cup of starter. I probably had around 3/4 of a cup. So I made up the difference with a little bit of ice water, which can help bring that dough together. And that cold water is pretty important because that keeps the butter nice and cold, because you don't want that butter to melt and start incorporating with the flour. Otherwise, your pie crust won't be as flaky. These pie crusts can sit in the fridge for up to 3 days, possibly even more. And what's cool about that is that it also long ferments those grains. But what I like even more than even that long fermentation is that by prepping this in advance, I can stay home centered without being home. I have pie dough ready to go for dinner the next day, so I can do other things that I need to do or that I want to do, activities with my family that we enjoy during fall, but still we have something homemade and scratch made waiting for us. A golden, beautiful sourdough chicken pot pie is nostalgic and is a really practical and useful way to create everyday beauty in your home. But at least for me, if I'm not making it in steps and stages, it becomes too cumbersome and it becomes too much work and I don't get it done. But if I focus on one piece at a time, one part of my home at a time, one part of my meal at a time, it comes together in the end in a way where I can create that sense of everyday beauty, where I do feel like I'm focused on some sort of home-centered lifestyle, but I'm not stuck in that grind all of the time. Okay, it is time to at least get started a little bit on this sourdough chicken pot pie. So the sourdough pie crusts have been in the fridge for over 24 hours, and in the morning, I am making the chicken in the Instant Pot. So I'm just taking a whole chicken, putting in a cup of water, and then also seasoning it with some salt and pepper. One thing that really helps with this is to get one of those little trivet racks with the handles that just makes it really easy to pull the chicken out when it's finished cooking. For a fresh chicken like this, you would just cook it for 6 minutes per pound. So this was a 5-pound chicken, so I cooked it for 30 minutes. Okay, it is time to make dinner, and I am finally assembling and baking this sourdough chicken pot pie. One thing I do to make dinner time easier is I make dinner earlier in the day. And something like a pot pie or a casserole really lends itself to that because they taste better as they've been sitting around. But that way, by making it a little bit earlier, the evening doesn't feel so hectic because we always need to get outside and get some energy out. And then there's bath time, story time, all the evening things. And trying to make dinner within that is pretty complicated. So it works for my schedule to make it in the late afternoon. But in any case, I am picking that chicken, chopping up some carrots, celery, and onion and sauteing them in butter, and then pouring in about 1/3 of a cup of flour and cooking it, and then adding in about 1.5 cups of chicken broth. I seasoned it with thyme, sage, and celery seed, and just the smallest pinch of nutmeg. That nutmeg is the secret ingredient. You really just want a tiny little pinch. Too much will just overpower it, but that little bit of nutmeg adds some depth of flavor that's almost unrecognizable, but really delicious. And just as a side note, anytime you're making like a milk-based or a cream-based sauce like that, you can add a little pinch of nutmeg. It's really good. But in any case, then I added in some milk and then the chicken and some peas, and then set it aside to cool while I rolled out the pie dough and assembled the chicken pot pie. In the past, I have always used an egg wash on my pies, but this time I tried a heavy cream wash and I liked it much better. It definitely doesn't get as shiny and it goes on a little more evenly because the egg wash has some water in it, and that water tends to sit on top of that buttery pie dough. So then it gets a little thick in some places and thin in others. So this worked much better. I baked this for about 40 minutes at 425 degrees. My husband and I both agreed this is one of the best things I've ever made. It is delicious. But by making the parts in a few bite-sized pieces over the course of a couple days, it was really manageable to put this together in the afternoon for dinner later that day. Next up on the menu, I am making sourdough biscuits with sausage gravy, which is my favorite Southern meal ever. So for these biscuits, I am first putting some butter in the freezer so it is nice and cold. And this calls for buttermilk, but I almost never have buttermilk on hand. And when I do, I never get through it fast enough. So in place of buttermilk, I am mixing together 1 cup of milk and a tablespoon of vinegar, and that works as a great substitute for buttermilk. This is a pretty classic biscuit recipe. The only real difference is I'm adding in sourdough discard. Now, you don't have to use sourdough discard for these. You can make any biscuit recipe, but I really like to add sourdough discard into recipes because I often have some left over from my feedings. A common question I get is, why do you need to put discard in something like a biscuit recipe? That recipe's already been perfected, which is true, but if you already have discard on hand, you might as well just toss it into something and it adds a little bit of extra flavor. Now, for these biscuits, I shredded the butter on a box grater and then I put it back into the freezer so it stays nice and cold. And I'm letting it stay in the freezer while I get the rest of the biscuit dough going and while I am preheating the oven to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. For a really long time, I shied away from making biscuits because the cold butter part freaked me out. I don't know why, it just did. It seemed like it was too complicated and the butter would always get warm and melt. But if you freeze it, shred it, and put it back in the freezer, it works really well. You can see here, it might be a little hard to see on camera, that milk is a little bit thicker and it almost has sort of like a curdling effect with it, which adds as that buttermilk substitute. So that's kind of cool. And now I'm just adding in that sourdough discard, the milk, and stirring it with a Danish dough whisk just until it comes together. I find that it's almost always easiest though at the end to use my hands to make sure there are no dry ingredients left. And now I am just flouring the counter and turning that dough out onto the counter. For biscuits, you really don't want any gluten development, at least not in my experience and for my taste. So I'm just turning it out, patting it into a pretty thick rectangle. I'd say about 1 inch thick. You could even do thicker if you really wanted like a nice tall biscuit. And I'm using a cup to cut the biscuits, but you could definitely use a biscuit cutter or a cookie cutter. So this made about 8 biscuits. It really depends on how thin or how thick you press out that dough. And these biscuits kind of underscore the simplicity of country cooking. There is no kneading. You don't have to worry about gluten development. There's no yeast. There's no rise, bulk fermentation. It's just a simple combination of ingredients that you cut into biscuit shapes and bake. I prefer to bake my biscuits in a cast iron skillet. So this is a 13 1/4 inch cast iron skillet just for reference. And I like doing this because it creates a bit of a crispier golden bottom on the biscuits, but also because it's that round shape, it kind of holds them together and they stay like a little soft on the edges and they're really good that way. Okay, we need to talk about sausage gravy. I am running into an issue where every restaurant here in southeastern North Carolina has a really weird sausage gravy. They are doing something strange in the restaurants and adding all sorts of creative ingredients. The last place I went to, it had a bunch of cheese in it and some like sort of tomato base. That is not a sausage gravy. It's something else. It wasn't bad. It just wasn't sausage gravy. Bless your heart. Sausage gravy is just sausage, some fat, flour, and milk. So I just browned some country sausage, took it out and put it on a plate. And then I took some beef tallow and combined it with about 1/4 cup of flour. And once that flour cooked for about a minute or so, I added in, I'd say about 3 cups of milk. And then you just stir it or whisk it until it thickens. And once it thickened, I added the sausage back in. Now, I've made this before without taking the sausage out, and it worked just fine, but I actually think this method worked a little bit better. It was easier to get a smoother consistency. And then I just seasoned this with a little bit of salt and a lot of black pepper because I love a lot of black pepper in sausage gravy. And these biscuits were done just in time, and they are beautiful. These biscuits were really hot when I was holding it, so I used a knife to cut it because it was kind of burning my fingers, but they actually just pull apart like a dream. They are so good and so flaky, and then piled high with some homemade sausage gravy. This is truly one of my all-time favorite meals. And over the last few years, I've discovered that if I want to have a really good classic sausage gravy and biscuits, I just have to make it at home. Sourdough lemon bars. And I will say we liked all of these desserts, but the lemon bars may have actually been our favorite as a family. So what's really cool about these lemon bars is that the thickener for the lemon filling is the sourdough discard. So what's important to note about that then, for this discard recipe, you will need to use active sourdough starter. I have a full YouTube video about the difference between active sourdough starter, inactive, and discard. I'll link that in the description box below, but essentially discard is just starter that you are taking out of the jar and putting somewhere else. And in this case, I'm putting it in lemon bars. So for the lemon bars, this is a shortbread sourdough cookie crust that I am just mixing in my stand mixer. This recipe will be on my blog soon, but while you wait for that, this is just a combination of about a stick of butter and a third of a cup of granulated sugar, and I am creaming them together in the stand mixer. And once the butter and the sugar is combined and nice and fluffy, I'm adding in about a quarter cup of sourdough discard, a little bit of vanilla extract, some salt, and all-purpose flour just to make a really simple shortbread dough. What's nice about this is that dough only takes a minute or two to combine in the mixer. You definitely don't want to overmix it. And then you simply just put it in a parchment lined baking dish and just use your hands and mash it down into an even layer. And then I poked it with the fork just to prevent any big puffing up of the cookie crust. And then you pop it in the oven until the edges are just beginning to brown. For me, that took about 35 minutes. And while that's baking, I am getting the sourdough lemon filling prepared. So as I mentioned, what's really important about this recipe is you need active discard. So you can see as I'm pouring in the discard here in just a moment on the video, it's really thick and bubbly. One way you can tell the difference between active and inactive discard is the consistency and the texture. And this is really thick. You can see it's kind of gloopy and sticking together and has a lot of bubbles. Sourdough discard can be a little tricky to mix into the ingredients sometimes, so it definitely helps to work with the emulsifiers first. So in this case, I mix the eggs and the sugar together, and then I put the sourdough discard in because that egg just helps it combine a little bit better. What sets this recipe apart from others is that active starter that you use as the thickening agent and also the fresh lemons. A lot of lemon bar recipes and definitely like store-bought lemon bars use lemon extract, but this uses fresh lemon zest and fresh lemon juice, which makes for a really beautiful and light lemon flavor. Once everything is combined, I am just pouring it onto that cookie crust and putting it right into the oven. You can see it seems a little thin and watery. That's okay. Just make sure you get it right into the oven and it will start to firm up as it bakes. I baked the lemon bars at 325 for about 40 minutes until the center was just a tiny bit wobbly. It's okay if it jiggles a little bit, that'll firm up as it cools. Then I let these cool to room temperature and refrigerated them for about 2 hours, and they were so good. That thick cookie crust with the lightly sweetened bright lemon is so perfect for summer. You could definitely sprinkle these with powdered sugar, but we ate these as is and loved them. Next up on the sourdough discard dessert menu is fudge brownies, and these are a dark chocolate fudge brownie. These are one of my all-time favorite recipes. This will also be on my blog soon, so all of these I'll get up there as soon as I can. I post 2 blogs a week, so it will take a little time to get them on there. The easiest way to stay in touch is to head over to moonandmagnolia.com and sign up for the mailing list so you will get this recipe right to your inbox as soon as it is published. These are not a cake brownie. These are a thick, dense, fudgy brownie that I think are best served cold, but you could definitely warm them up. The part I don't like about these brownies is you have to wait for them to chill to really get the full flavor profile of them. So you do need to have a little patience, which is about impossible with brownies. First, I'm just making a dark chocolate butter. So I warmed up a little bit of butter. It doesn't need to be hot, just melt a stick of butter. And then I added in 1 cup of dark chocolate chips. Then in a bowl, I mix together all of the dry ingredients. And once they are mixed together, I'm adding in that delicious chocolate butter. One thing that's nice about this recipe though is that you don't need active starter. In fact, I had some pretty old inactive starter in the fridge that I wanted to use up, and I like these with a little more sour flavor. So instead of using the rest of my active starter, I used up some leftover pretty darn inactive starter from the fridge, because the longer that starter sits there unfed, the more acidic and sour it will get. So if you want a more sour flavor, using an older discard will give you that. Now, if you want less sour, you can use a discard that is not quite as old. You can see this is a really thick batter. So it has some ingredients in it that absorb a lot of moisture, like of course flour, but also powdered cocoa, which creates a really thick batter that you kind of have to smooth over in the pan, but that's what makes them really fudgy and delicious. So unlike a lot of other brownie recipes, there's no leavener in this. There is a lower hydration, a lot of butter, and a lot of chocolate, and they get really fudgy. As you can see, those dark, dense spots are so good, but the key to really getting that fudgy-like consistency is to let them sit in the refrigerator until they are cold. I am making a sourdough peach cobbler, and I am using store-bought frozen peaches because it's the easiest way to deal with the peaches. You can definitely use fresh peaches, you can use canned peaches, but frozen peaches are a really easy way to do this. So I don't want you to ever feel like you can't bake things because you don't have time to peel peaches. Just use frozen ones. First, I'm getting the cobbler topping prepared. This is a combination of flour, sourdough discard, coconut oil, honey, some leavener, baking soda, baking powder, cinnamon, salt, heavy cream, and dark brown sugar. I'm mixing all that together and setting it aside. You could definitely long ferment this for more flavor, or if you have a gluten intolerance, if that is right for your dietary needs, you could long ferment it. If you're going to do that, I would just mix together the flour, starter, coconut oil, and honey, and then let it sit covered for about 8 to 12 hours. And then you can get back to the recipe, adding in the rest of the ingredients and finishing up your cobbler. Now I am getting the peach filling ready, and I do this right in my cast iron skillet so I don't have to dirty another dish. I have tested a lot with the right amount of peaches for this, and I found that 8 to 10 cups of peaches is about right. So if they're frozen, that means 8 to 10 cups of thawed peaches, or 8 to 10 cups of fresh or canned peaches. This is a really classic peach cobbler filling, so it's a combination of course, peaches, cinnamon, flour, butter, and dark brown sugar. And it's also really forgiving. So if you want a little bit sweeter, throw in a little more dark brown sugar. If you like a little bit thicker and gooier, add a little more flour. Really, you kind of can't go wrong here. And I'm putting this in the oven just until that butter melts, and then when it comes out of the oven, it's about 5 or 10 minutes, stirring all those delicious gooey ingredients together. Now, a classic cobbler requires you to roll out the dough and cut it like biscuits and lay them on top. I like to skip that part and make this as a crumble topping because it's a lot easier. If you are busy, if you have a million things going on and you can't even fathom rolling out a bunch of dough and cutting it for a cobbler, you don't have to. This is so good. You just bake it in the oven until it is brown on top. I think mine took about 35 to 40 minutes, and then serve it with a little bit of vanilla ice cream. And that is basically summer in one delicious and beautiful bowl. Chocolate chip skillet cookie. You can use any chocolate chip cookie recipe you want for this. It is so easy because you just make your cookie batter and put it in a skillet, and you're just making one giant cookie. Every starter or sourdough discard recipe calls for, of course, a different amount of starter, and that can actually be adjusted depending on how much starter you have and want to use and how you want it to taste. But for this particular recipe, I'm only using a 1/4 cup, which is really helpful for those of you who don't keep a lot of discard around. So if you just have a little bit of starter that you keep on hand and you're only discarding just a small amount with each feeding, this is a really good recipe for you. So I'm simply just mixing together the dry ingredients, and then of course mixing in the wet ingredients and dark chocolate chips. I use dark chocolate for everything because I love it, but you can use whatever chocolate chip you prefer. The trick to baking in cast iron is to make sure it is well seasoned. I'll leave a few links in the description box below for my tips and tricks for caring for cast iron, so that way you can bake without things sticking. But even though I have really well seasoned cast iron, when I bake, I still put a little avocado oil, or in this case some butter, on the skillet, so that way it definitely doesn't stick and it crisps up the edges. While the cookie was still hot out of the oven, I topped it with some coarse salt and a scoop of homemade ice cream, and it was so good. Off spring with a 1-bowl sourdough carrot cake. You can get this recipe over my blog at moonandmagnolia.com, but I am using fresh milled soft white wheat for this. So the original recipe calls for all-purpose flour, which of course will work totally fine, but this is fresh milled flour. And for soft wheat, you will need to increase the amount that you use because it does not absorb as much liquid, so you have to use more flour. So if you're measuring in cups, you'll want to add a 1/4 cup more per cup of flour, or 30 grams more per cup of flour. And now I don't know if I would call this a health food, but it is made with 100% whole grain flour and carrots, so it has a vegetable in it. So this carrot cake, I feel pretty good serving it to my family because it does have all of those great whole grains in it. Now, baking a cake isn't complicated and it doesn't dirty a ton of dishes, but if we're talking about simplifying, I really like making my cakes in one bowl, and I've been trying to change my recipes up a little bit so they use fewer bowls and fewer dishes, because really it's not the baking part that's complicated or hard, it's the cleaning up that is the worst. So by making it in one bowl, it keeps things a little more simple. So to make a cake in one bowl, you simply just whisk together the dry ingredients and then add in all of your wet ingredients. Now, this carrot cake has sourdough starter discard in it, and one thing about that is I like to put the discard on top of all of the other wet ingredients, so that way it can mix in a little bit better. Usually you would mix the eggs and the oil and the sourdough starter together in one bowl and then pour it in, and those eggs and the oil help mix in the starter. But since it's in one bowl, we're not doing that. But if you can keep it on top, it just seems to mix in a little bit better that way. I know it's tempting to use a food processor to shred the carrots, but I do encourage you to shred them by hand because the food processor releases too much liquid, and that can end up giving you a soggy cake, which is not what we want. But one of the best ways to simplify making a cake is to line it with parchment paper. So first, I'm spraying the pan with a little bit of oil, and that helps the parchment paper stick to the pan so it doesn't slide around when you pour the batter in. And now I'm just trimming up a piece of parchment paper so it's about 1 inch bigger all the way around than the cake pan itself. And then you just simply snip the corners at an angle about 1 inch or 2 so you can press it down and it takes the shape of the pan. I'm trimming up the edges a little bit because that makes it just a little bit easier to fit the parchment paper to the shape of the pan, but it's so easy and it makes cleanup a breeze. Okay, let's get back to this cake just for a minute. So I am making a cream cheese icing. So first I'm mixing together the butter and cream cheese, and now I'm adding in a little bit of homemade vanilla and a pinch of salt. Once that's all mixed together, I'm adding 1 cup of powdered sugar at a time for a total of 3 cups. You could probably cut that back to 2, which I'll do next time if you don't like a super sweet frosting. But either way, it will work totally fine. This was my daughter's first time helping me frost a cake, and she had a ton of fun. I think she ate as much as she put on the cake, but it was definitely worth the sweet memories together. A spread, yeah.
Yum, yum cake.
I think one of the most underrated times for baking is spring. Of course, we all love fall baking, but there is so much to love about spring baking and spring flavors.
Wow, look at that.
I really think spring baking really breaks you out of the same old with things like carrot cake and lemon flavors and blueberry and strawberry, things that we only really have this time of year.
Whoa, is that for me? I want that for me. Okay.
And what I really like about this is it's building memories through baking and through being together in the kitchen that aren't just around holidays. We always think about Christmas and fall, for example, as a time to bake together and build memories together. But the first day of spring, for example, is a great time to build memories together. We always make carrot cake or carrot muffins on the first day of spring. It's a family tradition, and I love it more than some of our holiday traditions. So that is it for this sourdough bake-a-thon. If you want to make sourdough and you don't know where to begin, I recommend downloading my free guide to making and using sourdough starter. It is a free 30-page ebook that you can use to learn how to make a starter, how to care for your starter, bake bread, and more. I will leave a link for that in the description box. If you are already proficient in making sourdough and you want to keep making bread for your family but want to squeeze those baking days into just one time a month, make sure to check out my new ebook for batch baking sourdough. It has my top recipes all in one place in an ad-free format, and then teaches you how to freeze and use those recipes throughout the month so you only have to bake one time, but you can enjoy them all month long. I hope you are having the most wonderful holiday season. I hope you are baking your heart out, and I will see you again next time.